It all started with a promise of a brighter modern future for the once mighty Ottoman Empire. The sultans, rulers of a vast territory bridging east and west, dreamed of railways, telegraphs, and schools. They wanted to prove that their ancient empire could stand tall among the modern nations of Europe. But beneath this glittering vision of progress lay a single critical question. Who was going to pay for it all? The answer, time and again, was Europe's bankers. By the mid-1800s, the Ottoman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Centuries of war, rebellion, and shrinking borders had emptied its treasury. Tax revenues were so low they could barely cover the cost of the army. Inflation was out of control, and corruption was a cancer eating away at the state. In their desperation to modernize and hold on to power, the empire's rulers turned to borrowing. Massive, unsustainable borrowing. At first, it seemed to work. They took loans from British and French banks to build railways, fund military reforms, and, ironically, pay off older debts. Between 1854 and 1875, the Ottomans signed on for 15 separate loans from European financiers. The interest rates were brutal, often over 10%, and because of commissions and bribes, the actual cash they received was far less than the official loan amount. Still, the sultans held on to the belief that modernization would eventually pay for itself. Meanwhile, European investors were thrilled. Ottoman bonds became a hot, fashionable investment in London and Paris. Newspapers praised them as safe, profitable, and even a force for civilization. The thinking was that these loans would tie the Ottoman Empire closer to the West, both economically and politically. What very few seemed to notice was that a huge chunk of the borrowed money was not building railways or schools. Instead, it was funding lavish palaces, personal luxuries, and the bloated machinery of a state desperately trying to look strong while it was rotting from the inside out. By the 1870s, the facade began to crack. Global grain prices plummeted, which meant tax revenues plunged with them, but the empire's administrative costs just kept climbing. Corruption was everywhere. Local governors skimmed money off the top, soldiers went unpaid, and peasants were squeezed mercilessly for taxes they couldn't afford. In many provinces, famine and revolt began to spread hand in hand. The empire's entire economy was now hooked on foreign credit. This meant that the slightest tremor in Europe's financial markets could shake the Ottoman state to its very core. Then, the perfect storm hit. In 1873, the Vienna stock market crashed, triggering a global long depression. Investor confidence evaporated overnight. Credit tightened everywhere. The very banks that had been so eager to lend to the Ottoman Empire slammed their doors shut. New loans dried up completely, but the empire's debt payments didn't stop. Every month, a river of gold flowed out of Istanbul to the financial centers of Paris, London, and Berlin. By 1875, the numbers just didn't add up anymore. The empire owed a staggering 200 million bolters, an astronomical sum for the time. It was spending more than half of its entire national revenue just on interest payments. In September of that year, the Ottoman government announced the unthinkable. It could no longer pay its debts in full. It declared a partial default, telling its creditors they would get only half of what they were owed in cash, and the other half in new, less valuable bonds. That single announcement marked the beginning of the empire's final economic collapse. Panic ripped through Europe's financial centers. Investors finally realized that the so-called sick man of Europe had officially gone bankrupt. Ottoman bonds became virtually worthless. Foreign newspapers attacked the empire, accusing it of deceit and bad faith. But inside the empire, the default unleashed something far worse. Chaos. Civil servants and soldiers went unpaid for months on end. Tax collectors became desperate, resorting to violence to extract money from starving farmers. In the Balkans, where resentment against Ottoman rule had been simmering for years, rebellions exploded. Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Bulgaria erupted in uprisings that would soon drag the empire into new wars it absolutely could not afford. Desperate to restore some semblance of stability and win back investors, Sultan Abdulaziz doubled down on symbols of wealth. He commissioned new palaces, outfitted his court in European styles and threw grand celebrations, but this extravagance only fueled the public's outrage. In 1876, the Sultan was overthrown in a palace coup. He was briefly replaced by his nephew Murad Vamp, and then by Abdulhamid II, a ruler who would preside over one of the most turbulent periods in Ottoman history. The new sultan didn't inherit an empire. He inherited an economic carcass. By 1881, the Ottomans were forced to accept one of the most humiliating agreements in modern financial history, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This wasn't just an agreement. It was essentially a foreign-controlled agency run by European bankers and officials. It was a financial occupation without armies. This body took direct control of the empire's most important sources of revenue, things like salt taxes, tobacco duties, and customs tariffs. It then used that money to pay back European creditors directly. The Ottomans had lost sovereignty over their own economy. Just imagine that for a second. A centuries-old empire reduced to a debtor colony. Its own finances were now governed by foreign suits, sitting in an office in Istanbul, deciding how much of its own money could go to its people and how much had to be shipped abroad. The empire's independence, political, economic, and symbolic, had been sold off, piece by piece, for short-term loans. The consequences went far beyond the balance sheets. The economic collapse weakened the central government's control over its provinces, which accelerated the empire's fragmentation. Nationalist movements in the Balkans gained unstoppable momentum, leading to more wars that drained what little resources were left. The empire's reliance on foreign powers deepened, paving the way for European influence and later outright domination across the Middle East. The debt crisis didn't just destroy the Ottoman economy, it dismantled the political foundations of the empire itself. And yet, this story sounds disturbingly familiar, doesn't it? The Ottoman collapse wasn't a one-off event. It was an early tragic example of a pattern we've seen repeat again and again in the developing world. Nations borrowing in foreign currencies, lured by the promise of cheap credit and rapid growth, only to find themselves trapped when the lenders come knocking. From Latin America's debt crisis in the 1980s, to Greece in 2010, and even to modern emerging markets under pressure today, the Ottoman story still echoes. The empire's fundamental mistake was believing that foreign money could buy modernization without internal reform. It borrowed to look rich, not to become strong. The palaces glittered, but the tax system was broken. The railways stretched for miles, but the workers who built them went unpaid. The empire wanted European capital, but refused to accept European accountability. When the bills finally came due, there was no foundation left to support the magnificent structure. The deeper tragedy is how this collapse changed perceptions. European powers stopped seeing the Ottoman Empire as an equal and started viewing it as a failing debtor that needed to be managed. Financial control quickly morphed into political influence. British and French interests expanded in Egypt, North Africa, and the Levant, often under the justification of protecting their financial investments. By the time World War I ignited, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a sovereign power, but a pawn in a global game it couldn't control. So what really destroyed the Ottoman Empire? Yes, guns, wars, and revolutions all played their part. But debt was the silent weapon. The empire didn't just collapse from conquest, it collapsed from compounding interest. The modern financial skyscrapers in London and Paris were built, in part, on the payments extracted from dying empires like the Ottomans. And the most haunting part of this entire story is that it all began with good intentions: modernization, progress, prestige. The empire didn't seek ruin, it sought relevance. But in chasing the appearance of strength, it signed away its very autonomy. Today, when we look at modern nations burdened by debt, countries that owe more than their economies produce, whose budgets are at the mercy of global creditors, the Ottoman warning feels sharper than ever. A state can survive famine, war, even revolution. But when it loses control of its own finances, when it no longer gets to decide how to spend its own money, that is the moment when sovereignty quietly dies. The Ottoman default of 1875 was more than just a financial event. It was the moment an empire learned that independence isn't only lost through invasion. Sometimes it's lost through debt. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. We'll see you in the next one.